Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Our guest today is Ahsan Butt. We discuss the history of Kashmir and the current situation after India stripped the Jammu and Kashmir regions of their limited autonomy status to bring it under the direct control of the Indian government. Also, we talked about Prime Minister Modi's history and his relationship with American officials and politicians, and why India is considered an important geopolitical balance to China. Ahsan Butt is an associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia, and a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. He generally works on issues of ethnicity and nationalism, security, international order, and the South Asia. And he's the author of the book Secession and Security, Explaining State Strategy Against Separatists. We recorded this on September 25th, 2019. Ahsan Butt joins us today from George Mason University in Virginia. Hello, Ahsan. Thank you for joining the show and welcome to Around the Empire.
Hi, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So if you would, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an academic. I'm a professor of international relations at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason. I've been at GMU now. This is my 8th year here. Before that, I got my PhD at the University of Chicago in political science. And before that, I was a college student at Ohio Wesleyan University. I've grown up in Pakistan and Singapore. And that's really it. I've written a book on separatist war. Some of your listeners may be interested in that. It's free to download, so you don't have to buy it. And I
great.
generally work on... Go ahead.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes. I'll make sure I get a link from you and link that book.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, go ahead.
Thanks for doing that. Since this is the first time you're on the show, just want to properly introduce you to the audience. And today we want to talk a little bit about Kashmir and India's Prime Minister Modi, sort of try to combine those two topics sort of at a high level. And I know this is an enormously complicated topic, but if you would, please tell us a little bit about the region of Kashmir, just so we can start with a basic understanding of that region.
Yeah, so Kashmir historic Kashmir was basically a Muslim majority province under the British. So when the British were ruling India, there were basically two types of territories that they ruled over, sort of directly ruled provinces that they were directly in charge of, and then these so-called princely states. They were called princely states because they were ruled by the local princes or the monarchs of that region. Those princely states had a degree of autonomy, but they still had to pledge sort of allegiance to the British Raj. Now, when the British left the subcontinent in 1947, they left in quite a hurry, and one of the things that they did not exactly take a great deal of care in, it was the final status of particular territories, including Kashmir, but not just Kashmir. So what happened was that the terms of the partition of the Indian subcontinent and the terms of the British exit from the subcontinent basically included the idea that all the Muslim majority provinces of British India, and there were 4 in so-called West Pakistan and 1 in so-called East Pakistan, which ended up being Bangladesh. Those Muslim majority provinces would become Pakistan. So there would be Sindh, Punjab, Balochistan, and the so-called Northwest Frontier province in the west, and East Pakistan, which 24 years later became Bangladesh in the east. So those are your Muslim majority provinces. In addition, and the rest would sort of become India. In addition to this sort of division, the princely states were given basically a nominal or technical choice of remaining independent. I say nominal or technical because in reality, it was basically untenable that these very small states, so princely states ranged in size from, a few football fields to, the size of like Belgium or Holland, right? Like
Oh, okay.
relatively small countries. So we're talking a big range here. One of these princely states, so these princely states were given the choice of either joining India, joining Pakistan, or remaining independent. A number of them chose to remain independent, at least initially, but were then taken over by either India or Pakistan. Uh, so that's basically the background. Now, Kashmir was probably unique in the sense that it had a Hindu prince leading a Muslim majority population. And so demographically, it probably should have ended up in Pakistan's hands, but he chose to remain independent. As soon as the British left in August 1947, the newly formed Pakistani state, made a play for it, made a military play for it, and launched a sort of so-called irregular armed struggle, basically sending, if not uniformed troops, but basically militants that would try and sort of take over the territory.
Right.
In response to that incursion, the Hindu Maharaja asked the Indian state for help. And the Indian state said, sure, we'll help you as long as you accede Kashmir to the Indian state. So he agreed to that. So the Indian state then sent in its troops, Pakistan sent in its troops, and there was a war over Kashmir immediately after independence. That war resulted in kind of a stalemate where India won about 2/3 of that territory and Pakistan won about 1/3 of that territory. And they drew a line in the map. And that line still exists today. It's called the line of control. So since then, there have been two further wars, at least, depending on how you count, at least two further wars over the territory, as well as insurgencies, rebellions, terrorist campaigns, primarily from Pakistan, over the territory. And it remains an important strategic territory. Like both countries want it for strategic purposes. It's a very sort of important location at the foot of the Himalayas and a lot of water and snow melt and etc. But there's also sort of a national identity question here because for Pakistan, the idea is, well, the Muslims of South Asia, Muslim nationalism in South Asia would be incomplete, or the project of Muslim nationalism in South Asia would be incomplete without having Kashmir, which was sort of the last piece of the puzzle. Conversely, India, I'm sure we're going to get into this, in the last 20 years that's changed, last 25 years that's changed, but certainly its roots lie in a sort of secularized democracy, right? That it doesn't matter that it's a Muslim majority state, that we're a secular democracy, and even if it's a Muslim majority state, it should be ours. So it was very important and in fact, it was the only Muslim majority state, and continues to be the only Muslim majority state in India. So it's very important for both countries' sort of national identity that Kashmir sort of be theirs. So there's been sort of constant jostling over it. As I said, there've been two further wars in 1965 and 1999 over it. And it continues to be a source of great tension in the region.
I see. Yeah, that's complicated. Now, let's switch over to what's happening right now in Kashmir. In August, we got the news that India had revoked the autonomy of what they call the J&K, or the Jammu and Kashmir region, and there was a lockdown and a blackout of communications in the area. And for our listeners, in the show notes, you'll find a link to Ahsan's op-ed in the Washington Post on this topic from August 7th. And in your op-ed, you refer to this as a, quote, nested conflict, which I really like that term. You say it's one in which international and domestic interests intersect, which you've kind of explained just already. But help us understand what happened in August and why.
Yeah, so, I'll first talk about what happened and then I'll explain why. So what happened here is that Kashmir, the state of Jammu, so the 2/3 of Kashmir that India controls is called Jammu and Kashmir. It's one of about 28, 29 Indian states that, like the US has 50, so India has about 28, 29. In addition to these states, India has so-called union territories, which are very small in number. One is the capital region, Delhi. And then there's sort of 3 or 4 very small, sort of far off, islands and so on. a very, very small like less than 1% of India's population. So the vast majority of India's population lives in states. Jammu and Kashmir. So there were two things that happened on August 5th, legally and politically. One was that Jammu and Kashmir enjoyed sort of a nominal autonomy. I want to emphasize that it was nominal because Kashmir has actually been under sort of Indian military occupation for decades, and it's the most militarized region in the world. There's roughly 500,000 Indian troops there for a population of about 8 to 10 million. So it's a heavily militarized region, and it's also the case that there's no real autonomy because anytime a local leader sort of runs afoul of New Delhi's imperatives, they're either removed or their government is sacked or is sort of directly ruled. But be that as it may, technically and legally and officially, Kashmir enjoyed a degree of autonomy under the so-called Articles 35A and 370, which basically enshrined the idea that, Kashmir is different from other Indian states, and, there are certain local rights with respect to like outsiders couldn't buy property in Kashmir. Like people outside Kashmir could not move into Kashmir and buy property. So this was sort of a move against settlers, the way you see in like the West Bank, for example. And also sort of this idea that the Kashmiri people have, more decision-making power, again, nominally, than the rest of India. This was a great source of consternation for the Indian right, for the Hindu nationalist right, that blames this degree of autonomy for the problems of separatism in the province. So for at least 30 years, there's been a Kashmiri nationalist movement that seeks to either become independent or accede to Pakistan. The Indian part of Kashmir, that is, either seeks to become independent or join Pakistan.
Okay.
So, and that movement has been ongoing for 30 years, and there was a sort of a pretty brutal insurgency in the early 1990s. So as a result of, or maybe as a consequence of that violence and that separatism and that nationalist movement, the Indian right-wing view is that the reason for the separatism is this idea of autonomy, that they have not been brought properly into the Indian fold. And so it's sort of, putting a spoiled kid in its place almost. That's the way I would sort of describe it. Like, how dare you even think about this? So,
wow. Yeah.
So it's sort of taking those articles away. But over and above those articles, taking those articles away or sort of abrogating those elements of the Indian Constitution, New Delhi went a step further and made and sliced, first of all, Jammu and Kashmir into two territories and made them union territories. So it's not just that they took away the nominal autonomy that they enjoyed, but they also went a step further and made it less of a state. They didn't even let it be a state, right? So there's like 28 or 29 Indian states. And so they've basically taken that statehood away and said, you're going to be directly ruled from New Delhi. So that was sort of an added insult.
Yeah.
And so knowing that the Kashmiri street would react very angrily to these moves, because it really was a slap in the face, the Indian state has preempted the possibility of unrest by, as you said, shutting off communication, shutting off the internet and phone lines, enveloping the state with even more of a military presence as if it wasn't militarized enough, detaining thousands of people, including children. We're seeing reports of torture. As usual, the pellet guns, so in the region, the so-called pellet guns that came to the fore in 2016 when there was another series of protests against the Indian state, and they were put down by pellet guns, which sort of blinded hundreds and sometimes thousands of Kashmiris. So those are back.
Literally blinded them?
Yes. When they get shot in the eye, I mean, yes. You can. I mean, your listeners can, go on Google Images and just search for pellet gun injuries India.
Oh, I see.
And you will see these sort of very, very stark portrayals of local Kashmiris who have been injured and sometimes killed by these pellet guns. So it's been a pretty repressive and oppressive environment for the last 2 months, even more so than normal. And so that's really where things stand right now.
Wow. And I maybe I just missed it because my consumption of media has changed lately. I'm not relying so much on the mainstream media these days, but I didn't see that much coverage or TV coverage of this situation either, which I thought was interesting. Now, again, maybe I just missed it, but um,
Uh,
go ahead.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know about television, but certainly, the papers that I read, at least like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, for instance, have all covered the issue in a good amount of depth. Now, there are restrictions because the Indian state has put restrictions on international and local and Indian media going into Kashmir. In fact, the New York Times just had a report last week on Pakistani Kashmir, where the idea was, hey, we couldn't go to Indian Kashmir, so we're writing from Pakistani Kashmir. And so it's not just that sometimes they're forbidden to go, it's just that it's also very highly controlled. As I said, there's no phone lines or internet connections there. It's hard to get in touch with sort of local reporters and sort of fixers and people of that sort. But there certainly has been coverage. The Times has covered it, the Post has covered it, British newspapers have covered it. Yeah.
Right, right. So let's get into the political part of this. Here's what I find to be confusing, partly because I don't know that much about India's Prime Minister Modi or about the political structures in India to begin with. But one of the things that I find confusing is that there seems to be like a warm bipartisan acceptance of India's President Modi. And there's also, he seems to be an extremely controversial figure, particularly among people on the left. And, let's start with, well, who is Modi? And then we can move on to his relationship with American politicians and officials.
Modi is a right-wing Hindu nationalist. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. His party is a right-wing Hindu nationalist party. He is of them. He was from the RSS, which is sort of uh, a socio-political organization that is inspired by so-called Hindutva, which is what we can just call it Hindu nationalism, the idea that India should be a Hindu state rather than a sort of secular state. So Modi is, he became prominent to the region and to the world in the early 2000s when he oversaw, and many would allege correctly, in my opinion, was part of an anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat, where he was the chief minister, where thousands of Muslims were killed. So his reputation as sort of an anti-Muslim, anti-minority figure should be entrenched. I mean, I guess we're going to get into why it's maybe not as entrenched as it could be or should be, but certainly amongst scholars and analysts of the region that I'm familiar with, it's pretty uncontroversial to refer to him as a right-wing Hindu nationalist, as well as his party, as the BJP is a right-wing Hindu nationalist party. When he first ascended to the prime ministerial position in 2014, there was some, not from me, but there were some suggestions that, because he is now Prime Minister of India rather than sort of Chief Minister of Gujarat, that, maybe he would temper the worst sort of excesses of the BJP and would sort of govern from the sort of center-right perspective, right? I mean, when we think of right-wing ideology, we think of basically two types of right-wing, right? One is sort of an economic right-wing, where we talk about, pro-business and low taxes and pro-investment and this sort of thing.
Yeah,
Sort of your
fiscal
Wall,
conservatives or
right?
yeah.
Your sort of Wall Street Journal right-wing, and
Hmm.
then there's sort of the ethno-nationalist right-wing, which is sort of your Breitbart right-wing,
Right, right.
and I think the hope. The unfounded hope, in my opinion, but the hope at the time from some people was that he would govern as a Wall Street Journal right winger rather than as a Breitbart right winger. I think those hopes have been laid to rest over the last 5 years. India has become even more majoritarian. This has been a slow and I mean, it's not all due to Modi. I mean, the BJP and the so-called Sangh, when we call it, but the Sangh refers to again the sort of this panoply of Hindu nationalist organizations within India, and the RSS is a primary component of that, and the BJP
So
is a sort
that's
of
what that's what that refers to. I've seen that word a lot, but I
yeah.
didn't really understand what it meant. Yeah.
Yeah, so the BJP is the sort of political spear of the Sangh, sort of the vote-getting wing of the Sangh. And but this has been a 25-year phenomenon. I mean, if you ask Indian scholars, or scholars of India, they would trace this back to the late 80s, early 90s. That's really where the character and nature of India's democracy began to change slowly and but perceptibly. It has been accelerated certainly under the BJP's direct governance in the last 5 years. The BJP has been in power before, under Atul Bihari Vajpayee, for instance. But Modi has sort of taken it to the next level. And it's not just about religion; it's about language. For instance, the BJP is trying to sort of make Hindi the national language of India, which is very controversial in different parts of India because India is a very multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural country.
Yeah.
There's literally hundreds of languages spoken in the country. And for instance, in the south, in the northeast of the country, it would be very controversial to make Hindi the national language, and you're seeing pushback against that. So there's sort of a linguistic uniformity being pushed. There's a religious uniformity being pushed. Muslims are being victimized. Sort of lower caste people such as Dalits are being victimized. There's been sort of an increase in lynchings, these so-called cow lynchings. So yeah, India, has become a much more majoritarian country recently, and going in the direction of Hindu nationalism, which shouldn't surprise us given who's in power.
And the anti-Muslim pogrom that you talked about, I've heard about that. Now, is it a documented fact that Modi oversaw that, or was he the leader of that region and he allowed it, or is there a consensus on that?
It depends on who you ask. So I guess there isn't a widespread sort of uniform consensus. Technically, it has gone through India's Supreme Courts, and Modi was. It was sort of deemed that he was not directly involved. But if you look at certain testimony from people who were killed and murdered, and family members of people who were killed and murdered, including members of parliament, it's pretty clear that, I mean, we should step back for a second. There's a great deal of scholarship. We'll step back from the Modi example here. There's a great deal of scholarship from people like Stephen Wilkinson to Ashutosh Varshney, so on, which basically locate the causes of Hindu-Muslim violence and riots. So Hindu-Muslim riots in India are reasonably common. In fact, there's sort of a topic of study. And the idea basically here is that you'll often see Hindu-Muslim violence in the run-up to an election, because it is a way of polarizing the public,
Yeah.
and basically making the Hindu bloc one bloc, rather than, because in other circumstances, different caste Hindus might vote for different parties depending on different economic interests and so on, for example, right? So one way of sort of making or papering over the divisions amongst Hindus is to polarize society along religious lines. So it is pretty well understood that people in power can engineer Hindu-Muslim violence. And if you look at Paul Brass's work, for instance, the classic work on Hindu-Muslim violence in India, or Stephen Wilkinson more recently, it's very clear that Hindu-Muslim violence is sort of caused essentially by people in power hoping to polarize the electorate. Now, with that is sort of the scholarly background. It's certainly the case that Gujarat was an example of this. It is the case that the Supreme Court basically of India gave him sort of a clean chit, so to speak. Well, you weren't directly responsible, but at the very least, we can say he looked the other way. Right. And I would go further than that. I think many people would go further than that. But yes, it's fair to say that legally he has not been held responsible for it. So that is worth clarifying. Yes.
Good. Thank you for clarifying that, because I tend to support Tulsi Gabbard, and I'm extremely confused by her support for Modi. And then I look and I see that Obama supported him too. I mean, and it seems like American politicians tend to either overlook that, or maybe they have a different opinion. I don't know. Maybe they think other things are more important. But getting into the bigger topic is, there seems to be this bipartisan acceptance of him, and we just sort of don't address any of the other issues. I mean, in one way, I can understand that. If you dissected and analyzed everything that any politician or any leader in the world has done, and you probably oppose all of them, right? So I can take a broader look at it that way, but this seems to be exceptional. And there are a lot of people who I respect a lot who um, have a real problem with this. So why do we see this why do we see this acceptance of Modi in the United States? Maybe it's a broader Western support. I'm not even sure. But what, in your opinion, why is this happening?
So first of all, I'll just quickly address the Tulsi Gabbard thing because I think it's worth, especially to supporters of Gabbard, I think it's worth sort of clarifying, and then I'll answer your sort of more general question on sort of Western and American acceptance of Modi.
Okay, great.
So on the Tulsi Gabbard situation, she does have some very admirable positions. I can see why she has so many supporters, especially left of center supporters. So I definitely see that. But it is also the case that when we talk about the RSS and we talk about sort of the Hindu nationalist movement, she is their candidate. If you look at and there has been documented sort of evidence of this from journalists in India as well as the West. I would recommend a story in the Caravan magazine.
Yeah, I just read some of that, in
Yeah,
fact.
go
But
ahead.
then you get down further in it and you find that the funding that they're talking about was like 10% of her early funding. So that kind of, I don't know, it kind of like negated a lot of what they had laid out, in excruciating detail. So there's
Yeah.
that. But anyway, go
No,
ahead.
that's fair enough. I mean, it's not that she's getting all of her donations from the RSS, to be sure, obviously, but it's a non-trivial component, and it's not just about donations. It's sort of ideology. It's about support. It's about who's
Right, we can see it. Yeah.
showing up to her rallies, who's serving as liaisons, who's setting up. In specific locations, who's setting up her, like I said, her rallies and her speeches. So it is definitely the case that she has support from that wing, and it's mutual. Tulsi Gabbard was one of the Gujarat riots or the Gujarat pogroms that I was just talking about. As a result of that, Modi was denied an American visa until he became prime minister.
That's right.
He was literally not allowed to come to this country. Tulsi Gabbard was one of the very, very, very few American politicians to actually speak up against that visa ban and said, no, he should be allowed into the country. So there's definitely something there. Now, I'm not saying that should mean that people shouldn't necessarily support her. I mean, people can support whoever they want. It's not for me to say, but it is a case that people who do support her should understand that, because I don't think, just from my impressionistic understanding of sort of her base, I don't think they know about that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So that's all I would say. Now, on to the more general question of why Modi has been accepted. The answer is very simple. India is a big market. It's a big, powerful, reasonably powerful country. So, I mean, we can get into the geopolitics first of all. The first issue is China. The first and the biggest issue is China. The US seeks to balance China. It considers China an adversary in the region, from not just the Barack Obama administration, but before the Obama administration. It's been reasonably clear that the US has sought to sort of minimize Chinese influence in Asia. And part of that is to ally and support countries that have a common interest in containing China. And so we see US partnerships not just with India, with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, and so on. So you should really see the US-India partnership primarily as an alliance to balance China, first of all. The second issue is obviously, India's economy, which has grown, grown quite a bit in the last, 20 years. And it's now, I believe, the fourth or the fifth or biggest economy in the world, not on a per capita basis. Obviously, on a per capita basis, India is still a pretty poor country, but because of its large population, large market, and as I said, sort of the reforms that took place in the early 90s, India's economy did take off. And so it represents a very attractive business and economic opportunities for American companies or American corporations. And so and we saw this with Barack Obama, who, if you look at his sort of ideology or his ideological predisposition would probably be troubled by people like Modi, right? Especially the sort of ethno-nationalist element of Modi. But when you're the president, you have a responsibility to sort of view things through the national interest rather than sort of your personal ideological interests. And seen through that framework, it's very clear that India is an important partner for the U.S. Like I said, in terms of balancing China as well as the large market. And so really that's why it's sort of geopolitical and economic interests which have ensured a stronger partnership between the U.S. and India.
Yeah. And in their case, they may be looking at, Modi is prime minister now, but he won't be prime minister forever. And, it's a much longer term relationship that they're looking for. And I assume that India is more open. There are a billion people there. And of course, every businessman here sees them as each one of those that's a billion consumers, right? So
that's right.
And and a market that's more open to our products and our business and our ownership probably than China. So there's that.
That's right. And I mean, let's not forget it's an English-speaking country, and that matters a lot.
Right.
When it comes to, educational, like there's a lot of Indian students in this country. There's Indian development in software and telecommunications. All of this stuff is important for the U.S. economy. So yeah, it's just, I mean, when you boil it down, it's an English-speaking country with a large market that also considers China an adversary. So when you think about it like that, it makes perfect sense why the U.S. sees India as an enticing partner in the region.
Yeah, and I have an engineering and an IT background, so I've had many Indian American or Indian expat colleagues. I live in New Jersey. There's a high population of Asian Americans here, so I live in and among Indian Americans all the time. We don't talk politics. I don't know what their politics are and things like that, but yeah, it's very well integrated into our. They're a very important component of our society. So,
right.
And then lastly, let's talk about Afghanistan. Now, we're trying to get out of Afghanistan. At least I am, right?
Yeah.
And so I listen, as closely as I can to the different people, particularly the ones who trend toward anti-interventionist and trying to get out of the imperial wars. So, in light of the bipartisan consensus on Modi, so my understanding is that one of the reasons why it's hard for any of our presidents to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan is the fear of giving China free rein to take some control of Afghanistan. And I guess that Kashmir region, as you said, is geopolitically, I don't know, I got the wrong word. Geographically really important. The border with China is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, it's a trade route. It's an ancient trade route to China. And so they fear giving China free rein, to take some control of that area and for it to become a pathway, particularly for oil and gas and other trade between Iran and China. And now you might think that it's only the war hawks who take that position. But I've actually heard some retired military whom I consider to be, very wise and generally anti-interventionist, or let's say foreign policy realists. They say similar things. That we may need to contain some kind of presence in Afghanistan or do something there to thwart China. And I mean people like Andrew Bakovich, Lawrence Wilkerson. So is that an accurate portrayal of the situation in your view? What I just said, I mean.
Yeah, I hear you. The China connection, I wouldn't overstate, at least from my vantage point. I think the reason that the U.S. is finding it difficult or the U.S. has not exited Afghanistan, I think has a lot more to do with stuff going on in Afghanistan itself, rather than sort of stuff going on outside Afghanistan. It might be the case that the U.S. seeks some sort of long-term, position in the region to sort of, watch China. But I mean, the U.S. already has a pretty heavy presence in especially in East Asia, right? When we think about, South Korea, for instance, Japan, etc.
So Taiwan, where it supplies arms and ammunition every year, billions of dollars worth. So I don't know how much China has to do with it. I mean, I suppose I'm willing to be convinced, but it's certainly not. I don't think the number one priority. I think what sort of has made the U.S. at least in the last. I mean, let me put it this way. I think that what's made the U.S. sort of hesitate are the terms of its withdrawal, which specifically you'd sort of have to admit that you lost, right?
Yeah.
You have to admit that the Taliban won, because the Taliban have militarily on the ground controlled vast swaths of territory, sometimes more than half the country, even when the U.S. And its sort of preferred or clientelistic or sort of, if you ask the Taliban, they would call them the puppet regime from Hamid Karzai first in the 2010s, Ashraf Ghani. Those guys say, well, we're the leaders of Afghanistan, right? We've been democratically elected and we're supported by the US. And the Taliban say, well, actually, we're the leaders of Afghanistan because you guys can't actually defeat us in a war. And so the US has sort of been caught between those positions of like, do we support the so-called democratic process and sort of stick by our guys who we helped put in power? Or do we recognize the facts on the ground, which is the Taliban are not defeated and have not been defeated in 18 years of war? And maybe, and so I think that sort of realization, certainly during the Obama, Hillary Clinton sort of, era, I think there was a reluctance in Washington, D.C. to recognize that the Taliban need to be sort of, if not entirely brought into government, at least negotiated with, and sort of given, quote unquote, their due. I can see why the U.S. was sort of reluctant to do that, because when you're a superpower and you're fighting these basically ragtag bunch of militants, you don't want to admit defeat. And so you're like, no, let's keep fighting, let's keep bombing, and maybe we can actually defeat them. But they haven't been defeated. And so now we're at the stage where the U.S. is under Trump and with his sort of envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, someone who has a lot of experience in the region, is trying to negotiate a U.S. withdrawal. And part of that negotiation is not taking place with the so-called democratically elected leaders of Afghanistan, like Ghani, but with the Taliban itself. And so the U.S. and Taliban are negotiating along with regional powers like Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and so on. And it's really that agreement. So the reason that's problematic is that the democratic leaders, or like people like Ghani, say, well, you're sidelining us. Like, what's the point of us being the government of Afghanistan if we're not actually negotiating with you? So by the same token, you can't really do that, because the Taliban say, well, those guys are puppet regimes, and if they're part of the negotiation, we will not be part of the negotiation.
Yeah.
So it's just a sort of complicated sort of dance almost in where the U.S. sort of has to respect the military facts on the ground, but also respect the political process that it has put a lot of money and political and diplomatic capital behind. I think it's finally sort of recognized the military facts on the ground, which is why I think over the last year or so we've seen sort of an acceleration of that so-called peace process. So I wouldn't really put it in terms of the China role. I would put it more in terms of just the messy situation of an insurgency that's been very difficult to defeat and maybe has not been defeated and in fact won the war.
Okay, fair enough. So let's wrap up. And so I'd like to just open the floor to you for anything that you might want to, tell this audience for whatever reason. And also, please tell us where to find your work and how to support your work and such.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a big sort of message for your audience. I appreciate them listening. My book is called Secession and Security. If you just want to read it, it's downloadable for free. All you have to do is Google Secession and Security, and you'll find it. If you want to buy a hard copy, it's available for like $35 on Amazon. And you can find all of my op-eds and my peer-reviewed work on my academic website. All you have to do is just Google my name. It's a Google Sites website, so it should show up. And it's all available for free, so you don't have to pay anything. And I look forward to any feedback that any of your listeners might have. My email address is also on that website, so you can sort of find ways to get in touch.
And are you active on social media?
I am on Twitter. It's my first name, Ahsan, and then my middle initial I and my last initial B. So SNIB.
That's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Ahsan Butt. Follow Ahsan on Twitter at SNIB, AHSANIB. Find his book on Amazon or in the OA Open Library, or visit his website. You can find these links in the show notes. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support's really important. If you can, pitch in at Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find the audio podcast in many places, many ways to listen to it. Find it on any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Leave me some comments, send some feedback. Appreciate it. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. And hey, we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.